You are currently watching the mighty Texas and Pacific number 610 being shoved back into the Palestine shops after a day of display. In charge of this challenging task is Texas State Railroad's very own 282 Mikado type locomotive number 30. While 30 currently spends its days carrying passengers through the piney woods of East Texas, originally this Mikado locomotive was a Louisiana native on the primarily lumber railroad that once ran just 15 minutes from where I live. Welcome to episode 4 of What Once Was, a collection of episodes showing what the region of North Louisiana's railroads were once like and what many consider better days of railroading. Today we'll be checking out an old short line that has become a faded memory in Louisiana, the Tremont and Gulf Railway. In the late 1800s, North Louisiana was beginning to get increased recognition for being a very profitable region for the lumber industry. Lumber companies were beginning to span across the entire area. In 1899, the Tremont Lumber Company was founded and a mill was built 9 miles from Tremont. Similar to the nearby lumber mill in Hodge, maybe 25 or so miles away, a rail line was needed to haul lumber products to distributing areas. 3 years after the formation of the lumber company in 1902, the Tremont and Gulf Railroad was chartered, and construction began from the mill to Winfield, Louisiana. Operations would begin in 1903 on the 11-mile stretch of track between Tremont and Eros. It wasn't until 1908 when the T&G's construction would reach Winfield. 2 years prior, in 1906, the name was changed from Tremont and Gulf to the Shreveport, Jonesboro, and Natchez Railroad, even though it would never even get close to Shreveport or Natchez, Mississippi. This name wouldn't last long though, and the company would return to its roots with the title Tremont and Gulf Railway. In 1909, a branch was constructed by the Tremont Lumber Company to be leased by the railway that spanned 20 miles from Jonesboro to Sykes. Construction was also in progress towards the south, pointed towards Rochelle, Louisiana. Throughout the existence of the T&G, one thing for sure is that the railway had no shortage of interchanges. In Tremont, there was a connection with the east and west main line of the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Pacific, which would later be under IC control, and then later Mid-South, and finally, present-day, Kansas City Southern. Spanning over all the years of operation, the T&G also had 3 total connections with the Rock Island. Other lines that the T&G interchanged with included the St. Louis, Iron Mountain, and Southern, which would be absorbed into the Missouri Pacific, the Louisiana and Arkansas, and several other smaller railroads such as the Monroe Southwestern and the Ouachita Northwestern. Even with all of these other railroads connected into their system, profit margins were not as high as originally hoped. In 1915, one of the first of multiple abandonments commenced on multiple smaller branches of the system. The original plans of extending the line towards Vidalia, Louisiana, just across the Mississippi River from Natchez, were fading as the years went on. Only a 4-mile branch would extend south of Rochelle in 1927. The Tremont and Gulf would not fall during the Great Depression, but like the rest of the country, it was certainly felt. Its primary source of revenue was falling downward, just like countless of other logging-based railroads in the United States. 500,000 tons of cargo became only 250,000. Passenger numbers were down to less than 800 total riders by 1933, so trains would have to become a mix of passenger and revenue freight. The lumber industry would somewhat rise back to its pre-depression state, but even before 1929, the peak freight traffic was not enough to sustain profits. The T&G would be forced into looking into other forms of freight services instead of lumber. Oil was discovered within the railway's region, and salt mines in Winfield would also assist in generating money, along with local pulpwood movements. Eventually, the lumber mill in Tremont that was responsible for the formation of the railroad was closed. Luckily in West Monroe, the Brown Paper Mill Company was built, and in 1943, the Tremont and Gulf would create yet another branch to West Monroe to connect with the paper mill and bring in pulpwood. The railroad would build 9.5 miles of the branch, while the mill would build the remainder of the 17.5 miles. 1944 brought another cut in the system in the form of shaving 3 miles off the Wagner extension. And unfortunately, a huge figure in the life of the Tremont and Gulf Railroad, James Stanley Joyce, would pass away in the same year. A native to Chicago, Joyce controlled two other lumber railroads, one in Texas and the other in Minnesota. While both lines were abandoned in 1932, in which I assume can be thanks to the Great Depression, the locomotives from his Texan line would be sent to the T&G. His wife, Beatrice Joyce, would succeed Mr. Joyce as president of the Tremont and Gulf. So during this time, it was obvious what the short line needed: lower costs and higher revenue. Even with slightly increased passenger ridership, passenger train service was completely cut in 1949, and behind that would be more track left to rot. With the Tremont lumber mill closed, the first stretch of track to be completed and operated on was abandoned from Tremont down to Eros in 1950. All traffic coming in from the Illinois Central will be brought in and out from West Monroe. In 1952, the short line would modernize in the form of dieselization. Two 800 horsepower switcher locomotives from EMD would arrive to the property, sealing the end of the purely steam short line. These were one of the last hopes of cutting costs to assist with the profit margins. Even cutting 56 of the 145 employees wasn't enough for the T&G to crawl out of the seemingly bottomless pit of deficits that equaled $1.5 million in debt, which in today's money is equal to $14 million. With no more moves to try and correct the course, the Tremont and Gulf would sell their property. On August 1, 1959, the Illinois Central would assume operations of the system. At its peak, the Tremont and Gulf operated 114 miles of track, but along with prior abandonments and the IC ripping up the remaining branch lines, that number greatly decreased. And just like that, the 57-year-old journey of the Tremont and Gulf came to a close. The Tremont and Gulf's locomotive fleet featured a pretty well-known collection of steam locomotives. The Tremont Lumber Company itself owned a variety of engines such as Shays built by Lima, 10-wheelers, and Prairie types. While I'm not going to overview every single locomotive to serve under the T&G, I am going to share some things that I found interesting about the roster. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, 282 Mikado No. 30 at the Texas State Railroad was originally built for the Tremont and Gulf. Built in 1917 with its eye-catching Vanderbilt-style tender, it served the railway until the diesels arrived. In 1954, it was sold to the Magma Arizona, which was still dead set on keeping steam power before landing on the Texas State Railroad. Tremont and Gulf No. 28 was also preserved at the Texas State Railroad. While not originally built for the Tremont and Gulf, it had a history in the Bayou State. Originally built as one of the very common Pershing 280 consolidation type locomotives for the Army in 1917, it would not be sent to the European front lines of the Great War, but instead served Fort Polk near Leesville, Louisiana. After serving the Army, 28 would be sold and delivered to the Tremont and Gulf, where it would remain until the 1950s. It would later serve the Temple Lumber Company, and then after that the Southern Pine Lumber Company in Texas, before being preserved by the Texas State Railroad, where it currently is under a massive maintenance project. But rest assured, 28 will be back to run trains through the heart of East Texas. And although this locomotive was not restored or even saved, I found it very interesting to read about. Tremont and Gulf No. 44 was built for the Louisiana and Arkansas in May of 1912 as No. 400. It was a 460 10-wheeler type locomotive that would later receive some very improving modifications. The 44 seemed to be a top workhorse for the Tremont and Gulf. According to the article from the 1960s that I used to gather most of my information, the pulling power on 44 was almost equal to a Pennsylvania G5 class 10-wheeler. These were actually considered some of the most powerful 10-wheelers ever built. So the fact that 44 was right up there with it is an impressive accomplishment. Even after the diesels arose and most of the steam fleet was sold off or scrapped one by one, the T&G kept the 44 around for a backup plan if the diesels happened to be out of service. Well, I hope you enjoyed and maybe even learned something about this underappreciated short line that once ran through the heart of the Louisiana pines. Credits to all of my sources will be down in the description. I want to give a huge thanks to Mr. Ralph Hawkins from hawkinsrail.net for allowing me to use photos from his collection and supplying the article for my information and extra photos. Until next time, I'll see you somewhere out there on the rails, and as always, thanks for watching.